Okay, so good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Thursday morning session. So, which is going to be on AFLOW, which is an integrated infrastructure for computational materials discovery. So, my name is Cormac Toher, and today we're also going to be host. This is the group. So, this is our team for today. So, the other people who will be hosting are Corey Oses, David Hicks, and Marco Esters, and they'll all be giving separate different sub-sessions this morning. They're also online here now, so if people have questions, they can also send them to questions to them. And then Stefano Cortarolo, who's the director of our center. So then just some little logistic things. I'm going to create 2 breakout rooms right now, if Zoom will let me. Giving up Zoom. Oh, it's here. More breakout rooms. So the first room, okay, I'll just support. Okay. So we're going to do it a little bit differently today with the breakout rooms for this morning's session because there's a group of us. So we'll have 2 breakout rooms. I just created them now. One is for technical support and the other one will be for AFLOW support. So if you have a question, just write the question in the chat like we were doing before. Most of the time we should be just able to answer the question in the chat, or whoever's hosting will be able to answer the question directly if it's relatively straightforward. But if you are having genuine technical problems, so if you're having problems either with Colab or with Zoom, then we'll assign you to the technical support room. And if you're having problems getting, like, say, for example, AFLOW to work or something like this inside your notebook, then we'll assign you to the support room. And then one of us will go inside and help you with this. But generally speaking, just send, but for other times, we'll do it like we were doing it in the last couple of days, where basically just if you have a straightforward question, we'll just answer it directly in the chat. And so we won't use the breakout rooms too much. Okay, so what do we try to do? What are we interested in doing? Well, first of all, sort of a general introduction is that when we're doing material science, we're generally looking at materials for novel applications. So, for example, some of the things we look for is thermal barrier coatings for putting, say, for example, the turbine blades inside jet engines to protect the blades from the high temperatures, but also protect it from corrosion. And so we have environmental barriers protected from the things like the exhaust gases, which can be very corrosive. Other examples might be super hard materials for things like machine tools, so drill bits, cutting tools, etc. We've also done work where we're looking for corrosion resistant alloys for things like medical implants, so things like bone screws for screwing together fractures, etc. Other examples of materials where people are looking for new materials applications, where people are looking for new materials, are things like, so for energy materials, like solar energy harvesting or solid state electrolytes for lithium ion batteries. Another example, more exotic, interesting example would be things like superconductors and heat sinks for advanced electronics. So for example, you might want a heat sink that is electrically insulating, but has a very high thermal conductivity, so to conduct heat away from the electronic circuitry. Okay, so here we have so to give you an idea of how large this material space that we're exploring is, I've here put just a periodic table. So if we look at all the non-radioactive, noble gas materials, this is something like, noble gas elements. We have something like 78 elements. If we look at the ways we can combine these, if we combine pairs, we get something like 3,000. Ternaries, 76,000. Quaternaries, we get over 1 million. By the time we get up to 5 elements, it's 20 million. And by 6 elements, it's 250 million. So that gives you some idea of the size of the space we're trying to explore. And then if you take into account different prototypes, so David will talk more about this later on, but if you take the different types of backbone structures, so the different ways you can arrange the elements, and also the different stoichiometries within each one of these pairs, so the different ratios you can combine them in, we get something like of the order of 10 to the power of 177 possible materials. So this is a massive number of materials. There's no way to, so using conventional trial and error by hand exploration, there's no way to do, this is basically completely intractable. So this is one of the reasons why in general people have started to use machine learning. But in order to do machine learning, you need data, and you need to really have a reasonable amount of training data that spans the material space. And to generate sufficient data, even for machine learning as a training and testing set, you still need to do some level of automation. And for this, we do automated computational materials discovery. So we start from two main sources. So we either have experimental structures. So we take these from things like the ICSD. So these are already observed materials. So things that have already been synthesized experimentally. Or we do what we call structural prototypes, which are the backbone structures. And David's going to talk a bit more about this, maybe starting around 10:30 today. So for them, we take these structures. So this is basically just atomic positions and lattice vectors. Then we do automated quantum mechanics calculations, so at the level of density functional theory, and we typically use the VASP DFT code. Then once these calculations are completed, we pipe these into this AFLOW database, which is available at aflow.org. I'll talk a bit more about this in a few slides. And then finally, once we have this database, you can either directly interrogate it to look for candidate materials for specific applications, or we can use it to train machine learning models. And in the last of the subsessions today, Corey's going to talk a bit more about some machine learning models that have been trained with AFLOW data and how you can actually use these models because they're available online through an API. Okay, so to talk a bit more detail about how AFLOW itself actually works. So it wraps around the DFT code. It's used to do input file generation. So we take this aflow.in input file, and David's going to talk a bit more about how to generate this file for different types of materials. Then from this file, once you run AFLOW with this file as an input, you can start up one or more DFT calculations. Then AFLOW will monitor these DFT calculations. If there's an error, it will change alter some of the parameters in the input file based on our own experience. So we've implemented this inside the AFLOW code, and we know if we get this error, it's a problem with this parameter, so we change the value of the parameter. And then we restart the calculation and keep going until eventually it converges. And then we can combine, if it also has post-processing functionality, so you can combine ensembles of DFT calculation results to do things like calculating thermodynamic properties, to do thermal properties, so for phonon calculations, or elastic properties to get elastic constants, bulk modulus, shear modulus, and so on. So you can calculate, you basically combine different strain cells and look at the stresses. So you fit the stress strain data to get the elastic constants. Then finally, we take these results and we pipe them into an online database for online storage and dissemination. And in the next part, Marco will talk a bit more about how this database works, how it's organized, and how you can access it. Okay, so the easiest way to access the database, and we'll do a quick short example using this, is to use is via this aflow.org web portal. So you can see now we have something like over 3 million entries. We have about close to 600 million properties now. And then you can see that we also have different types of properties. So we have elastic properties, thermal properties, band structures. We have different types of systems. So we have binary systems, ternary systems, and quaternary systems, and so on. And that's the main content of the database so far. And then within each one of these systems, there are multiple entries, so multiple different decorated prototypes. If you scroll further down this page, you'll see the different applications. So there's this advanced search application, which we're going to go into a bit more detail now. So we also have other applications, though. You can do the AFLOW ML application that Corey will talk about, and the AFLOW online and AFLOW prototypes applications that Corey is going to talk about a bit later. When we go into this advanced search page, you'll then see a periodic table. So you can basically search by select different elements. You can select groups of elements. You can then do property filters. You can also control the number of species. This is quite important because if you want to do, let's say, this example, So for here, I'm going to look for sodium and chlorine. So if I put in sodium chloride, I select the number of species as 2. So this means that I only get sodium and chlorine, not sodium, chlorine, oxygen, and so on. Because otherwise you get just everything that contains sodium and chlorine and anything else as well. Then if we look inside this electronics thing, we get the energy gap. So then we can get the electronic band gap in this case. Okay, so this is the filter for the electronic band gap. And then you can restrict the values to specific ranges, and then you can add other columns. So let me actually do this as a quick example, just to show you, to work through where everything is. So this is the AFLOW homepage. If I scroll down, I go to the advanced search. So then I can click sodium, chlorine, number of species is 2. And then here's the filter options. So I click electronics. Then I want to do this, add this column for the filter. And then I'll hit search. So here it comes up the electronic band gap. Here's the space group, the Pearson symbol. And you can see that we get 27 results. So there's 27 different examples of sodium chloride. Most of them are just a rock salt structure, but we have a couple here that are the simple cubic, so the cesium chloride type structure. Okay, so with that, we're going to do some quick example exercises. So first of all, just in case sometimes the aflow.org server can get a bit overloaded. So there's another server here. It's aflowlib.duke.edu/search/UI. I'm going to put this in the chat so people can use it. Yeah. So if you want to open up that page from the chat, and then we can try and do these exercises. So let me just open this presentation and I'll go through the exercises. This in the background. Okay. Okay, there we go. So if people want to try these now, and I'm just going to start running through them. Okay, so we go to the search page. And the first one is to look for silicon chloride with the zinc blend structure. And we want to find the band gap, the electronic band gap. So if people start getting results, they can start putting it inside the, maybe if you want to put it inside the chat so we can get a feeling how people are doing. Otherwise, yeah, I'm going to run through it down in a second so we can see how it works. I'll just do a quick poll to see how people are getting on, if people are following it or not, while they're, let this poll run while people are trying the first few examples, and I'll start running through the examples myself for the exercises. Okay, so let me start running through this example while we're waiting for this poll to run. Okay, so the first thing is to use the advanced search functionality to look for this silicon carbide. So in silicon, carbon, number of species is 2. Then we want to go look for the zinc blend structure, which is space group 216. So if we scroll down here, we look for space group relax. So this is the space group of the relaxed structure. We want to do 216. And we want to find the electronic band gap. So electronics, electronic gap. Okay, so there is a question in the chat, which is, are there only inorganic materials in the AFLOW database? The answer to that is mostly yes. We specifically try to avoid inorganic materials. So there, in the ICSD, there are some materials that are debatable of whether they are organic or inorganic. So there are basically some materials that don't really belong in the ICSD. So when we did some searches, now there's not very many of these. Then the other thing we do, so the ICSD is just one part of the database. It's a relatively small part of the database. The rest of the database is built by decorating what we call structural prototypes. And David is going to talk a bit more about that later. Again, most of these structural prototypes tend to be inorganic. And the ones we run tend to be mostly inorganic, so we tend to focus on inorganic materials. There are some structural prototypes, especially of the more recent ones we've added, which are more like organic structures, but we tend not to run too many calculations. So basically, yes, AFLOW is mostly pretty much all inorganic. That answers your question. Okay, so we want to find the band gap. So we hit search. I find that here it's 1.37 electron volts. Note, of course, that this is the band gap from DFT. So with all the usual caveats involved with this in terms of how accurate DFT is and the limitations that DFT has in calculating electronic band gaps, mostly due to the fact that this problem is accurately calculating unoccupied orbitals. Okay. So then the next question down here is, use the advanced search functionality, find the bulk moduli for materials containing titanium. Okay, so now we want to do titanium. This time we don't want to restrict the number of species, so we want to see everything that contains titanium. And we want to find the bulk modulus. So we can close these two. And we look for mechanical, bulk modulus VRH. And then we don't want to do a restriction. Oh, we do actually want to restrict the value because we want to find only values that have actually been calculated. So here if we hit restrict value, it will give the entire value range. And what this will do is it will restrict it to only materials for which the bulk modulus has already been calculated. So the bulk modulus is not calculated for all entries because it's a relatively expensive calculation because it requires multiple DFT calculations to be combined. So we've only done it for a subset of the elements, a subset of the entries. So that's why you should do a restriction. So you can only get the ones where it actually has been calculated. Okay, so we have 172 results. Then we can sort by clicking on the top of this label. So now this is smallest to largest. We click again, we get largest to smallest. And we get this iridium titanium intermetallic. So let's open up this page. And I'll give it a second for the page itself to load. So here's the structure. We scroll down some more, we can get some structural information. So we get like the basis vectors, the fractional positions, so the fractional coordinates for the different species. Then we have the space group. So this is a simple cubic structure. So the lattice type is simple cubic, Bravais lattice is simple cubic. And then we want to, if we scroll down to the bottom, we can actually see the electronic band structure. And you can see that there's no electronic band gap. So this material is metallic. Okay, and the poll nobody's voting.
There are a few questions about the calculations in our database.
Okay, let me check these. Okay. So the whole database, okay, this is actually a good question. It came up recently somewhere in something else. Results are different. Okay, so the whole database computed with the same function. So, okay, actually that's quite a good question because it's a little bit more to it. In general, yes, we primarily focus using the PBE GGA functional. So the PBE formulation of GGA, of the generalized gradient approximation. In the case of entries within ISCSD, so if they contain certain metals, especially D block or F block metals, these will have DFT plus U, so they'll have the Hubbard U corrections for the electronic structure. So that's for the ones in ICSD. If we look inside these binaries or ternaries, for example, then these will just be done with PBE, plain PBE. This is because in these calculations are done with decorated prototypes, and this we're really trying to do materials discovery. So we want to have accurate energies because we're really trying to do thermodynamics to see which materials are actually thermodynamically stable. In the case of, yeah, so this is the cone-sham band structure. Can you specify a space group? So you mean if you want to do a search on a space group? Yeah, so, okay, so to specify the space group, again, we go into crystal. Then we want to look, if we go down here, space group relax. So then we can do a restriction on the search. So in this case, let's say we want to do ones with, so this is 225. So let's say we want to do, so this is this space group number. So then we can do a, I don't know, okay, let's see. Yeah, so, right. Yeah, okay, because I changed the thing. So now we only get the ones with the 221 space group. Okay, so well, first of all, let me say about the follow up on the different functional types. Within the elements, we actually often have more than one functional. Let me close this. So here, if we look for titanium, you'll see there's multiple versions of titanium. We can also check the DFT type. So if we go into chemistry, we take DFT type, I think. We do the search. Then we can also see the DFT functional that was used to calculate this. So you can see POW PBE, CGGA. You can also see there should be some LDA. So in these elements, we generally have everything calculated. Okay. So then about the reliability of properties from the DFT calculation. In general, okay, so this is a broader question. It depends a bit on properties for which types of materials, on which types of functionals you're using, etc. So generally speaking, I would say DFT, especially for where we historically the AFLOW database is focused on metals. Well, let me just show very quickly how to order the list of outputs. So here, if you can order, you can basically just, if you click on the thing at the top, you can basically just sort. And then you can sort in the opposite order. So that's how you do sort. You just click on this header, and then you can sort by each column. Okay, so in terms of, generally speaking, DFT is pretty accurate, especially at the PBE level, for getting the right structure. So if you calculate all the different, so if you calculate, if you have a certain composition, you calculate the energies of all the different possible structures for that composition. Generally speaking, DFT will put them more or less in the right order. Okay. For that's at least for metals. For non-metals, there are some issues. And the errors in these relative energies for non-metals, or let's say in the formation energies, which is the difference between the linear combination of the elements and the actual composition you have, can be of the order of a few hundred millielectron volts, which is quite large. Now, we've recently implemented some so there's some sort of semi-empirical corrections that we've generated for this. So we recently wrote a paper on it, and if people are interested, I can send around, I can put the link in the chat later on. But it gives you an idea of how, how good these corrections work. And if we use, so we have, generally speaking, it depends a bit on which functional you use. We found that using this new scan functional, we can get the errors down to about 27 millielectron volts per atom, which is roughly room temperature in terms of thermal energy. So that gives you an idea of where you are. So this is KBT at room temperature. So that gives you an idea of what the accuracy level of the calculations can be. In terms of electronic band gaps with plain DFT, the Hubbard U kind of fixes things, but it's very much, it's not really predictive because you change the U till you're about to get the right band gap. In terms of what we do in AFLOW, we have a set of U. We have a certain set of U's that we apply, so for different, that we've basically taken from the literature. So it depends on how much, so that gives you an idea. So the band gaps tend to be okay, but I wouldn't necessarily use them for predictive. If you really want to get really accurate calculations for band gaps, you probably have to go to something like GW, but that can be quite expensive. For mechanical properties, so yield or strength properties, you can kind of estimate these from the bulk modulus, but a lot of these sort of, for real materials, these kind of properties tend to depend a lot on microstructure. So on things like on dislocations, defects, slip planes, these sort of things. That's not something we've really calculated. And it's something that's more of a macroscopic quantity. So it's not necessarily something you can really calculate with DFT. So you can let's say for this, you can calculate things like you can calculate things like slip planes and the what's the name of it? The stacking fault energies, but these can be quite expensive. Okay, so there's another question about materials project. So they kind of do something somewhat similar to what we do. They tend to focus on different sets of materials. So historically, at least, we've tended to focus a lot more on metallurgy and more focused on materials discovery within metallurgy. Materials project tend to focus very heavily on, they're really focused very heavily on battery materials. So they tend to focus a lot on very specific sets of, a subset of oxides, basically, especially when they're doing materials discovery and these sort of thermodynamic corrections. So that's what we've found. And again, you can sort of, I'll send around the link to the paper and you can actually see where we have some discussion of some of the differences between these two papers. Because yeah, so I'll send around this link because it addresses a couple of the questions that have been asked. Send around this link to this paper. Let's see if I can find it. I'll probably send it around later. Okay. Okay. The other thing that's sort of different is that we have a lot more, well, David will talk a bit about this in his session. We also have a lot of space group code that we've actually implemented themselves, whereas materials project tend to rely a lot more on external codes. So that's more in terms of the code difference. Okay, I think, okay. Let me try another poll, see how people are getting along, and then we'll move on, go back to the exercises. Okay, I'll let that run. Okay. And then before we wrap up this session, I'll just briefly talk about how you can install AFLOW. So we're not going to, well, we will install AFLOW in one of the notebooks, but we're not going to go through how to install it on your system here. But if you are interested and you want to try and install it on your own machine, it can be used on Linux, Mac, and Windows. So for Linux and Mac, it more or less works out of the box, at least for Debian-based Linux distributions. For Red Hat, I don't know if we've really tested it much on Red Hat-based distributions. Windows will require some additional software. So either if you have Windows 10, it'll be the Windows subsystem for Linux. Otherwise, you should install Cygwin, which is sort of a Linux emulator, terminal emulator. And then for more instructions, you can go to this aflow.org/install aflow. And this is where you can download the installation script and run it and get more details. You can also configure AFLOW. So if you look inside this hidden file, this .aflow.rc file, you can then set different options. So for example, you can set MPI, so message passing interface options for specific, so this if you want to run in parallel. You can also do things like VAS specific settings, so things like POSCAR paths, different precision defaults, etc. And you can also then set different output settings. So you can also set things like graphics, like sorry, if you want to use GNU plot to automatically generate output files, etc. And you can read the current version of the settings just using this command. Okay. So before we wrap up here, what we do want to install AFLOW is we want to install it inside the Google Colab notebook for session 2. So I'm going to send around this link right here now. I'm going to post it in the chat. So we're just going to go through the very start of this so we can start AFLOW installing and we can leave it then running in the background while everybody else is, while we're working on the, while we go through the other sessions. So if we want to open this,
Don't forget to save the file, right?
Yeah, I'll go through this now, exactly the instructions that they have to do. Okay, so here's the Colab. So if you open up the file, then you save a copy in Drive. So we save a copy locally. So open a new tab. Okay. Okay, so then the important thing is to make sure you keep this tab open. Don't close this tab, because if you close this tab, you'll stop the installation and you will need it later on for David's session around in about maybe 3/4 of an hour. So first we want to download the AFLOW installation script. So we hit this wget, we install the script. Now it's installed. Then we want to make the script executable. So we want to change the permissions. And then we want to run the installation script, and this will start it compiling. So you can see it's compiling here now. So just leave that running in the background. Keep the tab open, just let it run, and then we can move on to the next part of the lecture. Okay. Okay, so make sure to keep this open because we'll be using it again in about an hour's time or so. Just let the compilation run. Okay, so then just to wrap up, we just want to mention that we have more information on these past and future AFLOW schools is available at this aflow.org/AFLOW-school. So if you go there, you can see, for example, previous workshop we've done. You can see that there's actually some recordings that you can watch. So this was a 3-day workshop, for example, that we recently hosted. It was recently hosted by Texas A&M. So we go through a lot more of the AFLOW functionality. And if you are interested in participating in or hosting future multi-day workshops, please send an email to Stefano Cartarolo at stefano@duke.edu. Okay, and then just to give you an idea of what's going to come next. Next up will be Marco Esters. He's going to go through a database overview. He's going to talk about some of the interfaces, so where you can actually use programmatically access the data. So you can download whole sets of data and incorporate this into workflows. Then we're going to have a short break, maybe a 10-minute break. And then David will start working on this AFLOW sim, AFLOW prototypes, and AFLOW Excel finder. So he's going to show you how you can actually generate new AFLOW input files for starting to run for new calculations for different types of materials. Then at the end, Corey will talk about a machine learning model that was trained on AFLOW data and how you can access this machine learning model online and via this API. And then there'll be some concluding remarks. So with that, I think I'll just hand over to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to hand over to Marco.